Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in August. I read 8 books, a few horror novels and a few other things, and overall it was a pretty good month. First up, I read Lightning by Dean Koontz, and this had been on my shelf for a while, and then I saw that Cami over at Cami's Corner was reading this book for one of her harrowing horror series, so I figured I would pick it up at the same time. And unfortunately, I wasn't a big fan of this. This is about a character called Laura. The story follows her throughout her life, and it seems she has some kind of guardian angel who is protecting her and saves her from various incidents during her life. But who is this person and what are his motives? Now, first off, let's talk about the positives. I thought his writing was great, really solid, and I really enjoyed the characters. And for a lot of the story, it was really engaging and I was quite enjoying just going along for the ride. But the things I didn't like were where the story went. It's hard to say much more about it without spoiling it, so I'm just going to go ahead and spoil a part of the story. If you don't want to hear it, skip ahead to when the spoiler warning is no longer up. But basically, we're following Laura and this person who has kind of randomly appeared at various points of her life and saved her, and obviously, like any reader, you would be thinking, what reason would he have for saving her? She must have some important role to play in some bigger story. But no, he just fell in love with her. He thought she was beautiful and that she needed saving, and so yeah, that was the whole reason. There was no bigger story. It was just he fell in love with her. So that happened about like 2/3 of the way through the book. And it was at that point that I threw the book across the room because I thought that was the most inane thing that could possibly happen. So I ended up putting the book down at that point, and I just didn't know if I really cared to bother finishing it. But after a while I thought I'll give it a go. I did end up skim reading the rest of the book, and yeah, I'm glad I didn't spend much more time on it, quite honestly, because it just wasn't my cup of tea. I can see the appeal, it's just not really my thing. Which brings me on to another point, is that I would not class this as horror. Clearly a lot of people do, because on Goodreads a lot of people have marked it as horror, and also it's in this list of 100 horror novels that Cami uses for her harrowing horror series. So I guess I'm in the minority there, but for me, I would call it a thriller with some sci-fi elements, and yeah, it was just a very action-packed thriller for the most part. I wouldn't say there was any horror at all in it, so I don't know. I ended up rating this 2 stars out of 5, and the fact that it wasn't horror wasn't the reason I gave it such a low rating. Had I known a bit better what the story was, it honestly wouldn't have been something I would have picked up in the first place. So, either way, I wasn't really going to enjoy it, which is a shame because it seems like a lot of people really do enjoy this one, but just wasn't for me. I ended up giving it 2 stars out of 5. But I will leave Cami's channel linked in the description below. Definitely do go check her out if you haven't already. She's awesome, and her harrowing horror series is just one of many things that she does on her channel. Then I read All the Birds Singing by Evie Wyld. This is probably classed as literary fiction, non-genre, but it does have some dark elements and some kind of mystery elements too. And this is about a woman called Jake who is living in a remote part of Britain, and she's running a sheep farm, so it's pretty much just her, her dog and the sheep. And it seems that something or someone is killing her sheep, and The story is told in a really interesting format that I'm sure isn't going to be everyone's cup of tea, but I really liked it. So it's told in the present day in like a linear format, and then it's alternating with Jake's past, which is told going backwards. So if you've seen the film Memento, it's kind of something similar to that. I think it's a really interesting way to reveal information as the story goes on, and you slowly put together the past and the present. The sections of Jake's past are based in Australia, and I really liked the contrast between that hot and dry environment with the cold and wet environment of Britain. And as the story goes on and we slowly go further and further back in time, and it's revealed exactly what happened to Jake and how that has affected all the other points of her life and bringing her up to the present day. It was really interesting. There are some dark elements to the story, and it's pretty kind of bleak and heartbreaking at times, and yeah, it's a really good character study, and I think it touches on themes of how things that we do in the past really can affect us, and it's hard to escape from them. But yeah, this one was an excellent read, and I rated it 4 out of 5. Next up, I read Moondial by Helen Cresswell. This is, I think, what would be classed as middle grade, and I believe it was originally published in 1987. This is a story about a girl called Minty. She is sent away for the summer to go stay with her godmother, who lives across from a stately home. So Minty spends most of her time exploring the grounds, and she is drawn to this sundial, and the rest of the story involves some ghosts and a bit of time travel, and yeah, it was a really good story. I rated it 3 out of 5, you know, basing this on being an adult and reading something not aimed at me. I think it's one of those ones that I would have enjoyed a lot more if I read it when I was younger. For me, reading it now, it just felt like the setup was really interesting, and then the middle kind of dragged, and then the ending, everything just wrapped up too quickly. So I'm sure that's something that would not have bothered me when I was like 10 or something, but it was still a good story. I enjoyed it. If you're looking for a middle grade, you know, slightly spooky story, then this would be a good one to check out. I rated it 3 out of 5. Then I read The Witchcraft of Salem Village by Shirley Jackson. This is a non-fiction book aimed at younger readers. So again, I'm not really the intended audience, but this one was great. The writing, I'll be honest, I wouldn't have known it was Shirley Jackson, the Shirley Jackson, if I didn't already know. The writing is pretty simple and to the point, but it was a really fascinating and informative read. And yeah, I kind of flew through this in an afternoon. It was really engaging, and I'm really glad I gave it a read. I rated this one 4 out of 5. Then I read All Heads Turn When the Hunt Goes By John Farris. This was originally published in 1977. This is the Kindle version cover, which I think I bought on my Kindle at least a year ago, possibly 2, and it's been sitting there all that time, and I finally decided to read it. Really glad that I did. But to be a snob for a moment, I don't think this cover does it any justice, so I'm going to replace it with the original hardcover, which I think is much cooler. Anyway, this was such a great story, my first introduction to John Farris, and I've heard he is a bit hit or miss, but this is definitely a hit. And it's a Southern Gothic with voodoo elements. So yeah, if that sounds like your cup of tea, then I highly recommend checking it out. The story opens in the 1940s at a military wedding. The person getting married is the son of a wealthy family of the area who have a plantation. And without giving any super spoilers, the wedding ends in bloodshed, and this affects the whole family, and we follow a couple of particular characters dealing with the aftermath. We are also introduced to another major character, and it was really excellently done how the kind of two threads of the story came together. The voodoo elements were awesome. The atmosphere of the whole book was just super sultry. It's like, that's the only word I can really think to describe it, because of the heat of the location, and his writing as well is just really evocative. And it's the kind of writing that I had to reread certain passages because they were so good. This is one that I don't want to say too much more about and give any spoilers, so I'll leave it at that. But I thought it was excellent and I rated it 4 out of 5. Next up, I read A Nest of Nightmares by Lisa Tuttle. This is a short story collection, and I have a separate review video for this up already as part of my Nightmare Queens series, so I'll leave that linked below if you want to go check it out. But yeah, this was an excellent short story collection, a lot of them dealing with everyday fears, and a lot of them related to female characters and like specifically female experiences. But yeah, highly recommend this one. I rated it 4 out of 5. Next up, I read Crawlspace by Herbert Lieberman. This was originally published in 1971, although this is a later edition, and I buddy read this with my internet friend Rachel over at Rachel Reddit. I will leave her blog post about this book linked below, along with her Instagram and Twitter accounts. Definitely go check her out, and we both really enjoyed this one. So going into this, all I knew about it was that it followed a retired couple who live in a pretty remote house, and they find someone living in their crawl space, which sounds utterly terrifying. But that's really only part of the story. I just assumed that that was what the entire novel was about, but that all happens pretty early on. And so the story then develops into something else, which I wasn't expecting, but I really enjoyed it. His writing is fantastic, and during that initial section, it was pretty creepy. There were a couple of moments that might have given me goosebumps. And the story does move away from that creepiness, but it's still very tense. But this is also a really great character study. We're mostly following this retired couple, Albert and Alice. It's all told from Albert's perspective, and the third main character is this person who started living in their crawl space. And eventually the three of them form almost like a parent and son relationship, but it is kind of all over the place, and feelings change, and the other people in the local town get involved at times, and there's a lot of tension. There's elements of the small town gossip that they have to deal with, along with small town justice and that kind of tit for tat, eye for an eye mentality as certain things happen. So yeah, it's another one I don't want to say too much more about because it might get a bit too spoilery, but this one was great. It was really tense, really well written. The ending, I'll be honest, there were things I didn't quite like about the ending, but it didn't spoil my enjoyment of the rest of the book. I'm still really glad I read it, and I did really enjoy it overall. So yeah, I might have to look out some more Herbert Lieberman. If you read anything else by him that you would recommend, do let me know. I rated this one 4 out of 5. And last but not least, I read It by Stephen King. This edition is over 1,000 pages long. It's definitely the longest book I've read in a while, and that's also the reason why I haven't read it until now, because I've been intimidated by the size of this thing. But I'm really glad I finally picked it up. This is probably one of the most famous horror novels out there, and you probably already know the story, but just in case you don't, this is about a group of 7 children who are about 11 years old in the late 1950s, and they become aware of this presence in their town who is killing children, and the story is told while they're kids in the late 50s, and also picks up during the 1980s when they're all in their late 30s and they have to come back together again to try and fight it. I saw the 1990 adaptation of this when I was a young teen at a sleepover, and we were all terrified and it was amazing. So I still have a really strong love for that film or miniseries, and I couldn't help but picture a lot of the actors in that while I was reading this. But there is, of course, so much more that happens in the book than what they could cram into that adaptation. And it was really great to see the similarities and the differences and how there is so much more expanded upon in the novel. I ended up rating this 4.5 stars out of 5. The reason I just couldn't give it 5 stars is, I mean, this is a big book. This is a sprawling, epic story, and there were times when it just felt a bit too sprawling. You know, there are kind of side stories at times when we learn about other strange incidents that happen related to it. And I mean, some of them were still enjoyable to read, but at times they just dragged out a bit and it felt a bit like, get on with it, let's get back to the main story. You know, we've already established that lots of crazy stuff happens in this town, so do we really need another story to enforce that fact? But aside from that, the story, the characters were all excellent. The ideas and the imagination here are absolutely fantastic. There is some really crazy stuff that happens in here. It gets pretty brutal too. Obviously there's a lot of violence in here, and just as a heads up, there is domestic abuse and animal abuse, some of which was pretty hard to read, but such an excellent story overall. Really glad I finally got around to reading this one. And now that I've read it, I am curious to see it chapter 2, the new adaptation. I have seen chapter 1, and I'll be honest, I thought it was good, but I didn't think it was anything amazing. I think one of my problems is that Pennywise is made to look like someone's idea of a creepy clown, whereas Tim Curry's version in the 1990 adaptation, he was a normal looking clown, so it was all the more scary, whereas in the new one he already looks creepy, so in a way it makes him not as scary. I don't know, it just didn't work for me as much. But now that I've read the book, I would like to check out chapter 2 and see what it's like. But yeah, if you haven't read it, if you're like me and you've been putting it off for years, then I do recommend picking it up. It was really engaging, and although I said there were some kind of slower parts, overall it was great. There were some really creepy moments, like definitely some scenes that gave me the chills, which in this heat is quite a feat, and also some really touching moments that might have brought a tear or two to my eye. The friendship aspect of this is so good, and yeah, it was just a really great read. So 4.5 stars out of 5. So yeah, if you've read this one or any of the others that I read in August, let me know. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!